The distress signal came through at the worst possible time. Rebecca Hayes had 3 more deliveries to make before she could collect her payment and finally fix the heating system in her cargo ship. Winter routes through the outer territories were brutal enough without spending nights shivering in her bunk. But distress signals were not optional. Galactic law required any ship within range to respond. Rebecca changed course toward the source, a small moon orbiting a gas giant. According to her scanner, there was supposed to be a research station there. The database listed it as active, but something felt wrong. No response to her hails. No traffic patterns. Just that automated beacon screaming into the void. Her ship settled onto a landing pad covered in dust. The station looked abandoned, though her instruments showed the environmental systems were still running. Rebecca pulled on her pressure suit and grabbed her toolkit. Maybe this would be quick. Maybe they just needed a communications relay fixed. The airlock opened with a hiss that echoed through empty corridors. Emergency lighting cast everything in red shadows. Rebecca moved carefully through the station, calling out. Nobody answered. She found living quarters with meals half-eaten, now covered in mold. Workstations with screens still displaying data. It looked like everyone had left in a hurry. Then she found the laboratory. The door had been forced open from the inside. Deep scratches marked the metal. Rebecca stepped through and immediately wished she had not. Containment cells lined the walls, all empty now, their glass fronts shattered. Equipment lay scattered and broken. And in the center of the room was a massive creature. It had scales that shimmered even in death, deep purple and black. 4 legs ending in claws that could tear through steel. Wings folded against its back. A long neck and a head with intelligent eyes that stared at nothing. Rebecca had seen pictures in old databases. This was a dragon. A real dragon. But dragons were supposed to be extinct. The creature had died protecting something. Its body was curled in a defensive position. Rebecca walked closer and saw what lay beneath those massive wings. An egg. Pale white with veins of gold running through the shell. It was barely bigger than her head. She reached out to touch it and felt warmth. The egg was alive. A sound made her jump. The egg was cracking. Thin lines spread across the surface. Rebecca backed away, unsure what to do. The egg split open and a small creature tumbled out onto the floor. It was no bigger than a house cat, with tiny wings and a tail that seemed too long for its body. Scales the color of ash covered its skin. It looked up at her with bright amber eyes. The hatchling made a sound somewhere between a chirp and a whimper. It tried to stand on shaky legs and fell over. Rebecca knew she should call someone. Report this. There were proper channels for discovering unknown species. But as she looked at the dead parent dragon and the broken containment cells, she understood what had happened here. This station had been used for illegal creature trafficking. Someone had been collecting rare species and selling them. If she reported this, the hatchling would become evidence. It would be taken to some government laboratory and studied. Or worse, it might end up back in the hands of traffickers. The baby dragon crawled toward her. It was shivering. Rebecca picked it up without thinking. The creature was surprisingly light, and it curled against her chest seeking warmth. It looked at her with complete trust. Her scanner beeped a warning. The station's power core was unstable. She had maybe 10 minutes before a cascade failure. Someone had sabotaged the systems, probably to destroy evidence. Rebecca ran back to her ship with the hatchling pressed against her jacket. The dragon seemed to sense her urgency and stayed quiet. She barely cleared the landing pad when the station exploded behind her. The shockwave rocked her ship. Rebecca fought with the controls and managed to steady their course. When she looked back, there was nothing left but debris. The hatchling crawled out from under the seat where Rebecca had placed it for safety. It climbed up her leg and settled in her lap, watching her with those intelligent eyes. Rebecca tried to think logically. She should find the nearest authorities. Hand over the creature, do the right thing. But what was the right thing? Letting this baby disappear into bureaucracy or black markets? She thought about those empty containment cells, about the parent dragon that had died trying to protect its child. The hatchling yawned, showing tiny sharp teeth. Then it pressed its head against her hand. Rebecca felt something she had not felt in years, a sense of responsibility for something other than herself. She had been alone for so long, just her and her cargo runs, no connections, no complications. She made a decision that would change everything. Rebecca pulled up the station records she had downloaded before the explosion. She erased all mention of her ship being there. Then she set a course for the most remote supply depot she knew. She would need to modify her cargo hold, create hiding spaces, and she would need food. Lots of food if the size of that parent dragon was any indication of how big this little one would grow. The hatchling fell asleep in her lap, tiny puffs of smoke coming from its nostrils. Rebecca looked down at it and felt scared and determined at the same time. She had no idea what she was doing. But she was going to figure it out. The dragon was hers now, and she was going to keep it safe no matter what. 3 years had passed since Rebecca found the egg. She barely recognized her life anymore. Ash had grown. What started as a creature small enough to fit in her jacket pocket now stood as tall as her waist when on all 4 legs. His wingspan stretched wider than her cargo bay doors. His scales had darkened from pale gray to deep charcoal, with hints of silver that caught the light when he moved. Rebecca had learned to read his moods by the color of his eyes. Amber meant content. Deep gold meant curious. Red meant danger. Right now they were gold. Ash pressed his nose against the reinforced window of his hidden compartment, watching the stars stream past. Rebecca had spent most of her savings modifying the ship. False walls, shielded chambers that blocked scanner signals, ventilation systems that kept Ash comfortable but did not show up on station inspections. They were heading to a supply depot on the edge of civilized space. Rebecca only took jobs in remote areas now, places where inspections were less thorough, where people asked fewer questions. It was lonely work. She used to enjoy stopping at busy stations, sharing meals with other pilots, hearing news and gossip. Now she avoided crowds, kept conversations short, made excuses to leave quickly, but it was worth it. Every time Ash looked at her with those intelligent eyes, she knew she had made the right choice. The depot appeared on her scanner. A small collection of modules attached to an asteroid. Maybe 50 people lived there, mostly miners and independent traders like herself. Rebecca sent her docking codes and waited for clearance. Inside his compartment, Ash shifted restlessly. He hated being confined during docking procedures. Rebecca had taught him to stay quiet through a series of gentle touches and mental images. She was not sure when their communication had moved beyond simple training. Somewhere during the 2nd year, she had started to feel his emotions, his hunger, his boredom, his affection for her, and he seemed to feel hers too. Docking clearance came through. Rebecca guided her ship into the landing bay. Through the cameras, she watched 3 workers approach, 2 mechanics and an inspector. Her stomach tightened. Inspections usually meant trouble. She met them at the airlock with her most confident smile. The inspector was a woman from one of the reptilian species. She looked bored. She scanned Rebecca's cargo manifest and compared it to her ship's registration. Everything was legal. Rebecca had made sure of that. Her actual cargo was medical supplies bound for a mining colony 3 systems away. Then the inspector pulled out a biological scanner. Rebecca's heart nearly stopped. Biological scanners could detect life forms through most shielding. She had only used it once before during an inspection, and that had been when Ash was much smaller. She had convinced the inspector the reading was from her ship's algae-based air recycling system, but Ash was too big, now for that excuse. The scanner beeped as the inspector walked slowly around the cargo hold. Rebecca forced herself to breathe normally. The inspector paused near the false wall that hid Ash's compartment. The scanner beeped again, more insistent. The inspector looked at Rebecca with narrow eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, then alarms blared throughout the station. Everyone froze. The station's automated voice announced a hull breach in the residential section. Pressure was dropping. Emergency bulkheads were sealing. The inspector shoved her scanner into her belt and ran toward the residential modules. The mechanics followed. Rebecca stood alone in her cargo bay, listening to the chaos over the station's communication system. Children were trapped in a classroom. The breach was near their section. The emergency bulkheads had sealed them in, but the room was losing atmosphere. Rescue teams could not reach them in time. They were trying to cut through the bulkheads, but the walls were too thick. Rebecca closed her eyes. She knew what she had to do. She had always known this moment would come eventually. She opened the hidden compartment. Ash emerged, stretching his wings. He looked at her with questioning eyes. Rebecca showed him mental images. Children in danger, toxic air. The need for speed Ash understood immediately. He had always understood. Rebecca opened the cargo bay doors manually. The station's docking bay was not designed for creatures to fly through, but Ash was agile. He leaped into the air, wings catching the artificial gravity field. Station workers shouted in alarm. Rebecca ran after him, following through the corridors. People scattered as Ash flew overhead. Some screamed. Others just stared in shock. Dragons were supposed to be extinct. Seeing one alive was like watching a ghost made real. Ash reached the sealed bulkhead. He dug his claws into the metal and pulled. The reinforced wall groaned but held. Ash tried again, smoke rising from his nostrils. Rebecca had never seen him use fire before. She had not even been sure he could. Flames erupted from his mouth, white-hot and precise. The bulkhead began to glow red. Ash tore at the weakened metal and finally ripped it open. Inside, 6 children huddled together, their faces covered with emergency breathing masks that were almost empty. Ash crawled through the hole carefully. Rebecca followed, her own emergency mask in place. The children were terrified of Ash, but Rebecca spoke calmly. She loaded them onto Ash's back 2 at a time. Ash's scales protected them from the toxic atmosphere. He flew them out to safety, making 3 trips. By the time the last child was safe, the station's main bay was filled with people. Station security had arrived with weapons drawn. Ships from the Galactic Patrol were approaching fast. Rebecca stood beside Ash, her hand on his neck. She could feel his exhaustion. His confusion about why people were pointing weapons at them when they had just saved lives. She looked at the crowd and knew everything was about to change. Their secret was over, and there was no going back. The warships arrived within hours, massive vessels that made Rebecca's cargo ship look like a toy. They surrounded the station, weapons charged but not firing. Ash stayed close to Rebecca, his wings partially spread in a protective stance. Station security had lowered their weapons after realizing Ash had saved the children. But they kept their distance. Some looked afraid. Others looked amazed. All of them looked confused. A shuttle detached from the largest warship. It landed in the bay with perfect precision. The door opened and a figure emerged. He was tall, thin, with pale blue skin and silver hair that fell past his shoulders. His species lived for centuries. This one looked ancient even by their standards. He walked directly toward Rebecca and Ash without any guards. His eyes fixed on Ash with an expression Rebecca could not. Red sadness, hope, disbelief, all mixed together. He stopped a few meters away and spoke in a voice that carried through the silent bay. His name was Darius. He was a High Chancellor of the Galactic Council, and he wanted to know everything about how Rebecca had found a living dragon. They sat in a conference room that station authorities had quickly cleared. Ash barely fit through the door. He settled beside Rebecca's chair, his head resting near her hand. Darius sat across from them, his ancient eyes never leaving Ash. Rebecca told him everything. The abandoned station, the dead dragon, the egg. 3 years of hiding and running. She left nothing out. What was the point of lying now? Darius listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her the truth about dragons. They were not just another species. They were the reason the galaxy had known peace for thousands of years before their extinction. Dragons were natural empaths. They could feel the emotions of other beings, understand their fears and hopes. They served as mediators between species that could not understand each other. When conflicts arose, dragons would help both sides see past their anger and fear. They prevented wars, stopped genocides, kept the galaxy from tearing itself apart. Then a coalition of species decided dragons were too powerful, too dangerous. What if they used their abilities for control instead of peace? What if they chose sides? The coalition hunted dragons systematically. It took decades. Dragons were powerful but not numerous. One by one they died. The last known dragon was killed over 1,000 years ago. Without dragons, the galaxy descended into chaos. Wars that lasted centuries. Billions dead, species driven to extinction. Darius had lived through the worst of it as a young diplomat. He had watched peace collapse. Eventually, the fighting stopped from exhaustion rather than understanding. The current peace was fragile, built on treaties that nobody really trusted. Dozens of conflicts simmered just below the surface, ready to explode at any moment. And now, here was Ash, a living dragon. The first in 1,000 years. Rebecca felt the weight of his words. She looked at Ash, who was listening intently. She wondered how much he understood. Darius said the council needed to meet about this. Decisions had to be made. But he promised Ash would be safe, protected, valued for what he represented. Rebecca did not trust promises. But what choice did she have? They traveled to Olympus Ring, the massive station that housed the Galactic Council. Rebecca had never seen anything so huge. Cities floated inside spinning rings. Hundreds of species lived and worked together in an endless dance of politics and trade. Ash stayed in a special facility designed for large beings. Rebecca refused to leave him. They gave her a room attached to his chamber. She could see him through a transparent wall. He pressed his nose against it, and she pressed her hand to the same spot. Darius took Rebecca through restricted archives. He showed her video recordings from before the dragon extinction. She watched dragons larger than Ash working with diplomats. Their presence alone seemed to calm tense situations. When they focused their empathic abilities, even species that hated each other would find common ground. But Darius also showed her the hunts. The fear-driven propaganda that turned dragons from peacekeepers into monsters in the public mind. The celebrations when the last dragon supposedly died. It made Rebecca angry. These people had destroyed something beautiful out of fear, and now they wanted Ash to fix their problems. Darius understood her anger. He had felt the same way for centuries, but he believed Ash represented a second chance, a possibility that the galaxy could be better. Then he told her the complication. The council was divided. Some members saw Ash as a miracle. Others saw him as a threat or a tool to be controlled. And everyone was troubled by one thing. Dragons had never bonded with other species. They remained neutral to be effective mediators. But Ash had bonded with Rebecca. Deeply, obviously. His empathic abilities had developed around their connection. An ambassador named Kryn was leading opposition. He argued that Ash could not be trusted as a neutral party. That Rebecca's influence had corrupted him. That Ash should be separated from her and raised by council authorities. Rebecca felt cold fear. Lose Ash after 3 years together? After everything they had been through? She met with council members who would listen. She argued that separating them would be cruel. That Ash's bond with her did not make him less capable. That maybe the old way of isolated neutral dragons was part of why they were destroyed. But she could see doubt in their eyes. They wanted guarantees she could not give. Then Kryn made his move. He proposed a test. There were 2 species on the verge of war. 3 diplomatic attempts had failed. If Ash could help broker peace, the council would allow him to stay with Rebecca. If he failed, he would be taken away and raised according to traditional methods. Rebecca had 1 week to help Ash prevent a war. Something trained diplomats with years of experience had failed to do. She looked at Ash through the transparent wall. He looked back at her with those intelligent amber eyes. They had saved children together. Maybe they could save more than that. Maybe they could save everyone. The transport ship felt like a prison. Rebecca sat in the passenger compartment while Ash traveled in the cargo hold. She hated being separated from him, but the ship's designers had not planned for dragons. Through their connection, she could feel his anxiety matching her own. They were heading to Nova Concordia, a neutral station built specifically for diplomatic negotiations. Waiting there were representatives from the Titles and the Sundari, 2 species that had been fighting over a border system for 3 generations. Rebecca had spent the trip reading everything she could about the conflict. The Titles were aquatic beings who lived in underwater cities on their homeworld. They had colonized the border system first, building settlements in the oceans of a water-rich planet. The Sundari were desert dwellers who needed the rare minerals found in that system's asteroid belt. Both species claimed legal rights. Both had suffered casualties in skirmishes. Both refused to compromise. The transport docked. Rebecca rushed to the cargo hold and found Ash pacing restlessly. He pressed his head against her chest the moment she got close. She could feel what he was feeling. Uncertainty. Fear of failing. Determination to try anyway. She scratched behind his ears the way he liked. They would figure this out together. They always did. Nova Concordia was beautiful and cold, all polished metal and perfect climate control. Diplomatic staff guided Rebecca and Ash to a suite of rooms that felt more like a museum than living space. Everything was designed to be neutral. No colors that might offend, no decorations that might show preference. Even the air felt carefully balanced. The title delegation occupied the eastern wing. The Sundari had the western wing. They had not spoken to each other in 2 weeks. Both sides were preparing for war while pretending to pursue peace. Rebecca met first with the title leader. Prime Current Isla was a striking figure, translucent skin with bioluminescent patterns that shifted with her emotions. She moved in a wheelchair designed for beings adapted to water rather than air. Breathing apparatus covered her gills. Isla was polite but dismissive. She had agreed to this meeting only because the council demanded it. But she had no faith in a human cargo pilot and her pet dragon. The titles had been wronged repeatedly. The Sundari had attacked their settlements, killed their people. Why should the titles compromise with murderers? Ash sat quietly during the meeting. Rebecca noticed his eyes had shifted to that deep gold color. He was focused on Isla in a way that seemed more than just attention. He was reading her, feeling her emotions beneath the angry words. The meeting with Solar Warden Tamsin went no better. The Sundari leader was tall and covered in scales that reflected light like mirrors. His people evolved in harsh deserts where everything was competition. Strength was the only thing that mattered. Tamsin viewed the titles as weak. They cried about casualties when war was natural. They claimed ownership of space that they could not defend. The Sundari would take what they needed. That was the way of survival. Again, Ash watched and listened. His eyes stayed gold. Rebecca could feel him working through the complex emotions he was sensing. Both meetings ended badly. The delegations retreated to their wings. Diplomatic staff looked at Rebecca with pity. 3 days had passed. They had 4 left. That night, Rebecca could not sleep. She sat with Ash in the neutral garden space between the wings. Carefully maintained plants from dozens of worlds grew under artificial light. Ash stretched his wings, exercising after being confined all day. Rebecca voiced her frustration. She was not a diplomat. She had no training for this. She was just a cargo pilot who happened to find an egg. How was she supposed to stop a war? Ash made a low rumbling sound. Not quite a growl. More like a purr. He pressed images into her mind. Not words, but feelings and thoughts. He showed her what he had sensed during the meetings. Isla's anger was real, but underneath it was grief. She had lost someone close in the fighting. Maybe a child. Maybe a partner. The grief was so deep it colored everything else she felt. Tamsin's aggression was real too, but underneath it was fear. His people were running out of resources. The minerals they needed were not a luxury. Without them, the Sundari faced slow extinction. He was not fighting for conquest. He was fighting for survival. Both leaders were drowning in their own pain. Neither could see past it to understand the other side. The political negotiations focused on territory and rights, but the real barrier was deeper. It was trauma and terror. Rebecca understood suddenly. Traditional diplomacy had failed because it addressed the wrong problem. Compromise meant nothing if both sides felt existentially threatened. She spent the next day making arrangements. She asked for a private meeting. Not official negotiations, not with advisors or recording devices, just Hila and Tamsin in a neutral room with her and Ash. Both delegations resisted. It violated protocol. It could be dangerous. What if violence broke out? Rebecca pushed harder. What did they have to lose? The negotiations were failing anyway. 4 days until they all went home and the war started. Why not try something different? Finally, both leaders agreed. Probably out of curiosity more than hope. They met in a small room with only chairs and natural light. Isla and Tamsin sat as far apart as possible. Neither looked at the other. Rebecca sat between them. Ash settled in the center of the room, close enough that everyone could reach him if they wanted. Rebecca did not try to mediate. She did not propose solutions or suggest compromises. Instead, she asked them to talk about what they had lost. Not their species, not their governments. Them personally. Ash focused his empathic abilities carefully. Rebecca felt it like a warm pressure in her mind. He was not controlling anyone. He was creating a space where emotions could be felt clearly. Honestly, Isla spoke first. Her daughter had been in one of the settlements when the Sundari attacked. She was only 20 years old. She had wanted to be an artist. Now she was gone. Tamsin's hands tightened on his chair arms, but Ash's presence kept him from leaving. He felt Isla's grief. Really felt it. Not as an abstract concept, but as a raw wound. Then Tamsin spoke about his younger brother. starving because their mining operations could not produce enough, dying slowly because the titles blocked access to the asteroids where the minerals they needed were most abundant. Isla felt his fear, the desperate terror of watching someone you love waste away. Neither of them spoke for a long time after that. They did not apologize, did not forgive, but something had shifted. They had seen each other as beings who hurt rather than just enemies. It was not peace, but it was a beginning. The formal negotiations began the next day, but something had changed. Isla and Tamsin still disagreed on nearly everything. They still argued about borders and rights and historical grievances. But they looked at each other now. Really looked. They listened. Rebecca watched from the side of the room while actual diplomats worked through the details. Ash stayed close to both leaders. His presence seemed to keep their conversations from spiraling into anger. On the second day, Tamsin made a suggestion. What if the titles maintained control of the planet's oceans, while the Sundari were granted mining rights to the asteroid belt? The titles barely used the asteroids anyway. Isla considered it. Her advisors whispered urgently. Giving the Sundari what they wanted felt like surrender. But she surprised everyone by asking what guarantees the titles would have that mining operations would not damage the planet's water systems. The minerals the Sundari needed were radioactive. Contamination could poison the oceans. It was the first constructive question either side had asked in months of negotiations. The Sundari engineers explained their extraction methods. They could mine without any impact on the planet. In fact, they had developed technology specifically to avoid contamination because their own homeworld's limited water was sacred to them. The titles did not know that. They had assumed the Sundari did not care about water because they came from deserts. Small misunderstandings like that had built up over decades into a wall of hostility. Now those walls were coming down. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily. By the fourth day, both sides had agreed to basic terms. The titles would maintain sovereignty over the planet. The Sundari would have mining rights to the asteroids with strict environmental protections. A joint monitoring station would ensure compliance. Both species would share the costs and benefits. It was not perfect. Plenty of detail still needed work, but it was a framework that both sides could accept. On the fifth day, they signed a preliminary agreement. Cameras from news organizations across the galaxy recorded the moment. Isla and Tamsin stood together, still not quite comfortable with each other but no longer enemies. Rebecca stood in the background with Ash. She felt exhausted and relieved. They had done it. Against all expectations, they had actually done it. But as she watched the celebration, she noticed something. Ambassador Kryn stood apart from the crowd. He was not celebrating. His expression was dark, angry. Rebecca felt a chill. Success had not won Kryn over. It had made him more dangerous. The trip back to Olympus Ring should have been triumphant. Instead, Rebecca felt uneasy. Ash sensed it and stayed close. His scales had darkened, which usually meant he was worried. Darius met them at the dock. He looked pleased but also concerned. The council was meeting to discuss Ash's future. The successful mediation had impressed many members, but it had also frightened others. Kryn was arguing that Ash's success proved how dangerous he was. A being who could influence emotions, could control populations, start wars or prevent them according to his own will. And Ash was bonded to a human, a species that was young and ambitious and had a history of conflict. What would happen when there were more dragons? What if they all bonded with humans? Would humanity use them to dominate the galaxy? Darius tried to counter these arguments, but he was old and tired. He had fought for peace his entire long life. Rebecca could see the weight of centuries on him. The council session was held in an enormous chamber. Thousands of delegates from hundreds of species filled the seats. Rebecca had never felt so small, so out of place. She was just a cargo pilot. What was she doing here? Ash settled beside her. Through their bond, she felt his confidence in her, his certainty that she belonged here as much as anyone. Kryn spoke first. His voice carried through the chamber with practiced authority. He presented Ash's success as proof of danger rather than hope. He painted vivid pictures of dragons controlling politics, of humans rising to power through manipulation, of the fragile peace shattering under the weight of abilities that no species should possess. Many delegates nodded. Fear was easy to sell. especially to species that remembered war. Then Darius called Rebecca to speak. She walked to the center of the chamber. Thousands of eyes watched her, some curious, some hostile, some hopeful. She was terrified, but Ash was with her. She could feel him in her mind, supporting her. Rebecca spoke simply. She told the truth. She was not special. She was not some master diplomat. She was just someone who had found a scared baby and decided to care for it. The bond between them was not control. It was love. The kind of love that exists between any parent and child. Any two beings who choose to care for each other. Ash had not been corrupted by that bond. He had been strengthened by it. He understood connection and family and loyalty. Those things did not make him dangerous. They made him better at understanding others. The old way had failed. Dragons standing alone as neutral observers had been destroyed. Maybe the answer was not isolation. Maybe it was connection. Dragons who belonged to communities, who had stakes in peace, who cared about the people they helped. She pointed out that Isla and Tamsin had not been manipulated. They had been helped to see each other clearly. Their choices were their own. Ash had just removed the fog of pain and fear that prevented understanding. Was that really so terrifying? Or was it what the galaxy desperately needed? The chamber was silent when she finished. Rebecca returned to her seat beside Ash. She had no idea if her words had made any difference. Kryn stood to respond. But before he could speak, Ash stepped forward. The dragon had never addressed the council directly. Everyone watched as he moved to the center of the chamber. He was large enough now to be impressive, powerful enough to be intimidating, but his posture was peaceful. Then he spoke. Not with words, with direct empathic communication that every being in the chamber could feel. Ash shared what he was. Not what others feared he might be, but what he actually was. His memories of Rebecca caring for him. His joy at helping the children on the station. His satisfaction at seeing Isla and Tamsin find common ground. He shared his purpose. Not imposed by genetics or training, but chosen. He wanted to help. To bridge gaps between beings who could not understand each other. To prevent suffering. And he shared his hope that he was not alone. That somewhere there might be other dragons. That together they could help the galaxy be better. Not through control. Through understanding. He showed them his bond with Rebecca. Let them feel the depth of connection. The trust, the love. It was not corruption. It was the foundation of everything he was. When Ash finished, many delegates were wiping tears from their eyes. Even species that did not cry were visibly moved. Kryn had no response to that. How could you argue against something you had felt directly? The council voted. It was not unanimous. Some still feared what Ash represented. But the majority made their choice. Ash would remain with Rebecca. They would be recognized as partners. And humanity would be granted a position on the council to support whatever came next. Rebecca held on to Ash and felt like her heart might burst. They had won. Against all odds, they had actually won. 6 months after the council vote, Rebecca stood on a mountain overlooking valleys that stretched to the horizon. Real mountains on Earth, real air filling her lungs. After years in space stations and ships, the feeling of wind on her face was almost overwhelming. Ash circled overhead, his wings catching thermal currents. He had grown even larger, the size of a small transport ship now. His scales gleamed like polished metal in the sunlight. When he roared, the sound echoed through the valleys. He was magnificent, and he was still the same being who had curled up in her lap as a hatchling. The Guardian Academy was taking shape in the valleys below. Construction crews from a dozen species worked on buildings designed to house students from across the galaxy. Landing pads for various ship types, training grounds, meeting halls. All of it centered around the idea that peace required work and understanding. Rebecca walked down the path toward the main complex. Her title was Director of the Guardian Corps. She still felt like a fraud sometimes. What did a cargo pilot know about running an academy? But then she would remember that she had raised Ash. She had helped him become what he was. Maybe that qualified her after all. The first class of students had arrived last week. 30 individuals from 20 different species. Some were young. Some were experienced diplomats looking to learn new methods. All of them wanted to be part of something bigger than themselves. Rebecca entered the main hall and found her students gathered around Ash. He was demonstrating his empathic abilities, carefully showing them how he sensed and interpreted emotions. The students were fascinated. Some were also terrified. Ash was patient with all of them. A young human woman approached Rebecca. Her name was Sarah, and she had traveled from the outer colonies to be here. She had questions about the training program, about what it took to work alongside beings with empathic abilities. Rebecca answered honestly. It required openness, vulnerability, the willingness to feel what others felt and let them feel you in return. It was not easy work, but it was necessary work. Sarah asked the question Rebecca had been expecting. Would there be more dragons? Rebecca led her to a secure facility built into the mountain. Inside, in an environment controlled for temperature and humidity, were 3 containers. Each held genetic material recovered from ancient sites, material that scientists believed could be used to bring back more dragons. It would take years, maybe decades. The science was complicated and uncertain, but the possibility was real. In the meantime, Ash was training humans and other species to work as mediators even without empathic abilities. To listen carefully, to look beneath surface conflicts, to help others find common ground. It was not the same as having dragons, but it was better than nothing. A communication alert interrupted her thoughts. Darius was calling from Olympus Ring. Rebecca took the call in her office overlooking the valley. The old chancellor looked even more tired than usual, but he was smiling. He had news. The Titles and Sundari had just completed their first joint mining operation. No conflicts, no violations. Both sides were actually cooperating. The success was inspiring other species to revisit their own conflicts. More importantly, several species had requested Ash's presence at their negotiations. The demand was overwhelming. Ash could not be everywhere at once. That was why the Academy mattered so much. They needed to train more mediators, build more bridges, create a culture of understanding instead of conflict. Darius also had personal news. He was retiring. After centuries of service, he was finally ready to rest. He wanted Rebecca to take his position on the council. Rebecca immediately refused. She was not qualified. She was barely qualified to run the academy. A council position was beyond her abilities. Darius laughed. It was a dry sound like wind through old trees. He told her that was exactly why she was qualified. The council had too many people who thought they knew everything. It needed someone who understood their own limitations. Someone who led with humility and compassion. Rebecca said she would think about it. Darius said he would ask again in a month. They both knew she would eventually say yes. After the call ended, Rebecca walked back outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors she had almost forgotten existed during her years in space. Ash landed beside her, folding his wings carefully. Through their bond, she felt his contentment. He was happy here, happy with the work they were doing, happy with her. Rebecca scratched the scales under his jaw. 8 years since she found an egg on an abandoned station. 8 years since she made the impulsive decision to keep a baby dragon instead of doing the sensible thing. That decision had changed everything. Her life, Ash's life, maybe even the galaxy. She thought about the students training below, about the species learning to understand each other, about the possibility of more dragons, about a future where connection mattered more than conflict. It was overwhelming, terrifying, impossible, and yet here they were. Making it happen. A shuttle approached from orbit, more students arriving. Rebecca recognized the species markings, Titles and Sundari traveling together, coming to learn from the dragon and the human who had helped their peoples find peace. Ash rumbled softly. Rebecca felt his amusement. They had come so far, from hiding in cargo bays to training diplomats from across the galaxy. She looked at him, this massive, powerful being who could have been so many things, weapon, tool, monster, but who had chosen instead to be a guardian. A bridge, a friend. Rebecca had raised him, but in many ways he had raised her too, taught her to see beyond her own small concerns, showed her that connection was stronger than fear. A student called out from below. They needed help with an exercise. Rebecca started down the path. Ash followed, his footsteps shaking the ground slightly. She thought about what she had told Sarah earlier, about what it took to be a guardian, openness, vulnerability, willingness to change. She had learned those things from Ash, from watching a baby dragon grow into his purpose, from letting him change her life completely. Rebecca smiled. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring. More challenges, more conflicts to mediate, more impossible situations to navigate, but she was not alone. She had Ash, she had students eager to learn, she had allies across the galaxy, and she had hope. Real solid hope that things could be better, that understanding could triumph over fear, that love between different beings was not weakness but strength. The future was uncertain. But for the first time in her life, Rebecca was not afraid of it. She had raised a dragon, and together they were going to change the galaxy, one connection at a time.